Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Prone to Wander, a conversation delving into the Christian life and how we are to live a life that glorifies God and enjoys Him forever. This podcast is somewhat unique, as you've probably already noticed, because it is a conversation between two people who are almost exactly 60 years apart. My name is Jonathan Claxton, and I've had the privilege for most of my life to live a few blocks away from Reverend Douglas Petersen, who also just happens to be my grandfather. We often talk about the Christian walk and wanted to give a window into these conversations for those who might be interested. We will cover a variety of topics and we will express our own opinions. These particular conversations arise from matters I have wanted to discuss with my grandfather, so I'm learning most of these things along with you as the listener. We hope you enjoy and pray that God works through even these conversations to bring us all closer to Him. Well, Grandpa, the last 2 weeks have been super enjoyable, and thank you so much for being back on here. And I think a fair question might be, as we've been talking about recently, why in the world have we spent 2 hours talking about 25 years of your life, and why has it taken so long?
I've been asking the same question. Um, and it turns out I think there's a good reason for that. Um, and that is because, let's say, the first half of my life, anyway, which would be 40 years, of course, but the first half of my life was much more tumultuous than the second half. It And it's interesting because we've been trying to get to the issue of why did it take so long for me to get into the pastorate and what happened after I did, because I was 38 years old before I finally entered the pastorate. So that nearly half of my life had passed by that point. But as I say, that first half is much more tumultuous. There were many more changes taking place in my life during that time, or at least changes that were evident and I was aware of. Whereas the second half of my life has tended to be slower with fewer changes, um, and also deeper uh, and harder to describe, I suppose, than some of the more obvious things that took place earlier. It's kind of like a marriage. In the first part of your married life, you're getting to know each other, and there are all kinds of things going on, in your life and your family, and so you don't really have time to just be together and to see that relationship go deeper and become more mature and more and in many respects closer, more profound. And Susan and I certainly have been experiencing that in recent years. But just to give you some idea, when I say tumultuous in the early years, we moved 14 times in our first 23 years of marriage. Uh, Now, some of those moves were only across the street or to another house a few blocks away, but many of them were across state. We were in 8 different states in the first 23 years of our marriage, whereas in the past 35 years, we've only had 2 moves, and they were within one state. So just on that level alone, things have slowed down considerably compared to what they were in those first years. So I could talk too about, as I've already mentioned, the kinds of changes that were taking place in my life. I talked about the theological change where I'd grown up in an Arminian dispensational Baptist background, didn't know anything else. I knew there were other uh, theologies, other ecclesiologies and so forth out there, but I didn't really know very much about them, didn't understand them. I thought we were right, everybody else was wrong, so it made it pretty simple. Um, but then I was introduced to the Reformed faith, to Calvinism in my sophomore year of college. Uh, I once I accepted the Calvinistic theology and worldview, I just took it quickly and whole hog. But that was a massive change. But then, as I mentioned, as a result of an upheaval at Shelton College itself, we had a whole new faculty came in, and that faculty brought with it a whole new dimension of Calvinism that I had known nothing about. And that was the Kuyperian, uh, Herman Dooyeweerd, the great Dutch Calvinist Christian philosopher, others like him, and the whole idea of worldview and its impact on life. So that was another, and once again, I found that very exciting, but it was revolutionary in a lot of ways because it not only expanded my thinking, but changed it in many ways. Uh, During those years, of course, I went to two different colleges. I started out at Wheaton College, I went to Shelton College, and two different grad schools, seminary. Uh, I was also in the Army, as I mentioned in our last uh, meeting. I was facing the draft, and so I enlisted in the Army in 1968, spent 25 months on active duty. Uh, that we'll maybe talk about that if you want to, about what happened in the Army, but it was another remarkable way in which God used circumstances over which I had no control at all, um, to direct me to where he was going to put me eventually. 2 years of 25 months of active duty, and then back into the Army in 1973 when I was already embarked on another career as a Christian school administrator, to spend 13 years in the active Army Reserve. And that overlapped even into the time when I went into the pastorate. But that was demanding in many ways in my life. And then different career kinds of jobs. As I mentioned, I had been striving to become a librarian. I decided at the end of my senior year in college, I needed to figure out what I was going to do since I was determined not to go into the pastorate, and decided I wanted to be a librarian. And I mentioned last time the struggles I had in trying to get into grad school and how the Army interrupted, and I went to grad school. Finally ended up getting a position as a librarian. That only lasted 1 year. And when we talk more about my call into the pastorate, I'll talk about how that affected that. But I ended up not going into the pastorate after that 1 year. I got a position as a Christian school administrator in Memphis. So we moved from uh, uh, New Jersey to Memphis with that career change. I was there for 4 years before going to seminary. And then while I was in seminary, they offered me the position as a librarian there at the seminary. And at the same time, the Christian Study Center, a Christian think tank sort of organization back in Memphis, offered me the position of director there. And so I took that position. So I spent 4 years with the Christian Study Center, actually overlapped into the pastorate as well. And then, of course, three pastorates, including 12 years in my stated supply pastorate here at Westminster and Albemarle. And then the family changes that take place during that time. Of course, our marriage, um, when I was just shy of my 21st birthday, Susan was also just shy of her 21st birthday. We got married because we just, well, we didn't want to wait until I finished college. So we got married while I was still at college. I returned to Shelton in the fall of 1965, just a few months after we got married. So there was a move there from West Collingswood, New Jersey, down to the southern tip of New Jersey. But then one thing I did not mention the last time, and I suppose it's because it's still one of those things where there's a lot of heartache associated with it. Anyway, we had a strange kind of experience. One thing that doesn't happen very often, especially in a small college like ours, is that one of the married students uh, has a baby uh, while they're at college, and that happened unexpectedly to us. And at the sort of the end of our first year in marriage, we found that Susan was pregnant, and that it was an interesting experience because a small college is a small Christian college is sort of like a family. Everybody knows everybody, and so there was naturally a lot of excitement. The ladies gave a big shower for Susan as we were getting closer to the delivery date, and of course in my mind I'm scrambling around thinking about, well, it's been tough enough to try to keep bread on the table for the two of us, and have a suitable place to live. How are we going to be taking care of this baby? But I just assumed the Lord would provide, and we just moved ahead. And then finally, on very very early in the morning, like 1 or 2 in the morning, on Friday the 13th of January, 1967, Susan woke me up and said, "I'm having these cramps every couple of minutes here, and I don't know what's going on." I said, "I think we better go to the hospital." So we piled her in the car in the hospital. I called the doctor, and those days there are no cell phones, of course, so you have to call on your landline. And we called the doctor and headed for the hospital in the Cape May courthouse, which was about maybe 25 minutes away from Cape May itself. And I got her there, and I can still remember this old battle axe of a nurse who greeted us in the obstetrics department, and yelled at me about why I didn't get her there sooner. And I tried to explain that she didn't tell me any sooner. But anyway, she said, "Well, you might as well go back home, and it's going to be a while before anything happens here." So I got back in my car, drove back down to Cape May. And just as I was opening the door to our apartment, the phone rang, and it was the doctor. And he said, "Well, you have a son." And yeah, just like that. And so, immediately your excitement level goes to the moon. And then the next thing he said, "But there's a problem." He said he's got a severe case of spina bifida, which is a deformity of the spine, and he's got to be moved to Children's Hospital in Philadelphia immediately. And so you go from the moon to the cellar in just one moment. I still can remember the utter sense of hopelessness that I felt, because I had no idea what spina bifida was. I'd never heard of it before. Had never entered my mind that we would have a baby who was disabled. It just was beyond anything that I could comprehend at the moment. And I remember just saying, "Oh Lord, help!" But immediately it popped into my mind, um, that we had a nurse, one of the wives of one of my fellow students, another married student who had just come that year, uh, was a nurse. And so I called her and told her we needed a nurse to ride with her. I told her what happened, and I said we needed a nurse to ride in the ambulance with the baby. And she said, "Oh, I'll be happy to do that. No problem." So right away, I had somebody there. So we went up to the hospital, and the local volunteer rescue squad drove up, took their ambulance up there, and we loaded our baby. We had named him Mark Douglas. When I say ours, of course, Susan had given birth, but she never even got the opportunity to hold him in her arms because of his condition. She just got a glimpse of him there in the delivery room, and the next thing he was on his way to Philadelphia. And I had to drive my '64 Chev, which you could simply never keep in alignment or keep the wheels balanced. That was a terrible car. And I was following that ambulance up the Garden State Parkway at about 100 miles an hour, and my car was shaking and my teeth were getting rattled. And I could see Rosalie Voga, the nurse, sitting in the back window of the ambulance. And every once in a while, she would look at me and then she would hold her thumb up to say, he's still holding on. And I was crying. I was just so distraught, didn't know what to say. An old gospel song that I'd learned in my Armenian dispensational Baptist childhood came back to me. It goes something like this: Precious Lord, take my hand, lead me on, help me stand. I'm tired, I'm weak, I am worn. Through the storm, through the night, lead me on to the light. Precious Lord, take my hand, lead me on. And I just sang that verse over and over again all the way. It was about a 2 hour trip to the hospital in Philadelphia, maybe a little longer. And we got him there to the hospital, and they were a wonderful children's hospital. They told me they would do everything they could for him. And I remember standing there by the window of the nursery. I could see his little, see him in a little incubator or whatever they called it, respirator uh, compartment kind of thing. And he was just fighting to breathe. His little body was just, you could see him struggling. And so I went back over to the river. My in-laws lived right across the river in New Jersey and from Philadelphia. And so I went over to the house there and waited. And the next day on Saturday, we got a call from the hospital to say that he had died. So in the midst of all these things that we've been talking about, all these theological changes, philosophical changes, and all the rest of that kinds of thing, you can have something like that comes into your life, which is just like a meteorite landing on you. But once again, I saw when you think there's something you can't bear, um, the Lord just provides people and things and all kinds of things. Uh, that peace that passes understanding, all that type of thing. If as long as you don't refuse to accept it, I've known people who, when something like that happens, they just absolutely will not accept it, and so they end up rejecting all of the comfort that can come with it. And I learned something about my wonderful wife, your grandmother, there too, because my mother-in-law, one of the first things she said, now when you get back to Cape May, before she gets home in the hospital, you make sure you pack up all the baby things and put the crib away, and so she doesn't have to see that when she comes back, because it's going to be so hard for her. And so anyway, I got back in my car, drove back down to after making arrangements for the baby's burial. And so we donated his body to science because spina bifida was little known. And so any help that they could have in terms of doing an autopsy, an examination, was going to help uh, try to find a way to prevent that from happening to other people. So we thought at least that was, some good that could come out of his very brief life. And we knew he belonged to the Lord anyway. That understanding of covenant children that had come with Calvinism was a great comfort. But anyway, I got back to Cape May and went to the hospital to see Susan. And the first thing she said to me, she said, now don't you touch any of those baby things or that crib. I want to pack all that up in a certain way so I will know where to find it when we need it the next time. And I looked at her and I thought, you are the man in this family. I just, yeah. And that's where she's been ever since, too. So there was nothing that turned out very unusual about that. Uh, but then that leads into all the family changes that come along as part of that, these early years of our life. Because a few years later, after I had been in the Army for 2 years and had gone to graduate school. Um, Along comes your mother. Karen was born in August of 72. And I think 1 week after she was born, we moved to Memphis to where I became director or became the principal at Evangelical Christian School, the principal over the elementary schools, and eventually the headmaster there. And while we were there in Memphis in September of 74, your Uncle Carl was born. And then um, in 76, much to the, what can I say, distress of the board there, because the school had gone through a very difficult situation financially and otherwise, and we had just gotten things straightened out when I decided that I needed to go to seminary because I felt this all of a sudden this sort of strong pull uh, to prepare for the ministry, for the pastorate. And so I resigned from a perfectly good job. It just so happened that Susan was pregnant again when I did that. And so after we packed up and moved to Philadelphia so I could go to Westminster Seminary, our son Andrew was born in October of that year. And so as my wife, as her grandmother likes to tell everybody, there she was with me working full time to keep food on the table and going to school full time. There she was with three tiny children all by herself, which was pretty much true. And then again, in the middle of seminary, I had two more offers that almost came to me simultaneously, that neither one of which I had sought. I was working part time in the library at that point. They had found out I'd had a master's degree in library science and needed help in the library, so they asked me to work in the library, which I did, and I could go to classes and all the rest of the kind of thing. It was a very convenient job. Very Lord provided really wonderfully in that situation for a steady income and but also a very flexible situation. Uh, but the librarian at the time was nearing retirement, and so the president of the seminary, approached me about becoming the librarian. And at the very same time, I had gotten a call from the Christian Study Center, a sort of Christian think tank in Memphis, and they offered me the position of director of Christian Study Center. And as was generally the course of my life, both when I uh, first looked at Christian education, when I was finishing my graduate work at Rutgers, and now again, I felt, well, I didn't pursue this, I didn't look for this, I didn't ask for this, so this must be the Lord. It must be saying this is what He wants me to do. I'm not necessarily, I'm not sure that that's necessarily a good way of thinking about it, and it probably shouldn't be uh, the only way of thinking about it. But I am reminded of something one of my elders told me when my first church back in Memphis, Mac Robinson, very wise man. And I was at that time considering a call to another church. Um, and I asked him, I said, Mac, how do you really know if it's the Lord? Um, and he said something I thought was really helpful. He said, I tell my sons, if all the pieces come together without you having to push any of them, you can be fairly sure it's the Lord leading. But if you have to push any of the pieces into place, you better start thinking it might be you. so, so in this case, all the pieces were coming together uh, without my having to push any of them. So off we went to Memphis again. And then, like I say, the rest is history, because it was there in Memphis that while I was working at Christian Study Center, that I was finally introduced to the Associate Reformed Presbyterian Church, a call to, I actually had made the decision to pursue the pastorate before that, but I was in a church connected with a PCA, so I was under care of the PCA. But the call to the church in Memphis, I had not pursued. That just came out of the blue to me, and as you say, the rest is history. But also, still family wise, um, along came the children, and then along came the grandchildren, and of course the marriages, and now the great grandchildren. Christmas gift cost has is approaching the national budget, I think. So it's but it's all been wonderful. But that's why I think the first half of my life takes so long to get through, because there were just so many things happening in comparison to relatively peaceful last few decades. So I'll take a pause there and let you see if you have some questions.
Sure. Yeah, that's kind of incredible. We just got through 55 years in 20 minutes, I think. No, that you also were not supposed to make me cry this morning, but thank you for sharing that story. Um, I had never heard most of the details of that with Mark, and but I think something that people tend to marvel at, and you may want to talk about this more when we talk about specifically your pastoral ministry, but people tend to marvel at the fact that you were able to go through seminary in your 30s with three children. So I know you briefly mentioned that the Lord just kind of provided and you worked, but what did that look like? Maybe even on a daily basis, what did your schedule look like?
Well, seminary is a little different from grad school and college in the sense that the courses can be arranged in such a way that you have a fair amount of time around them. And in fact, I think we only had classes on 4 days of the week. So there were some openings there for um, work opportunities, for instance, that we might you might not have in another situation. In addition to that, because the Lord had provided 2 years in the Army for me, uh, I had GI benefits uh, under the GI Bill of Rights. So, for example, we were able to buy a home in Memphis when I first went there to be in school at Evangelical Christian School. Under ordinary circumstances, we would not have been able to buy a home because I didn't have the money for a 20% down payment or even a 5% down payment. I didn't have any money at all. But because under the GI Bill, you didn't have to have money for a down payment, you could get a VA loan, they call it a Veterans Administration loan. Um, we did that. Uh, and then when I finally decided to go to seminary in the fall of '76, as you said, we had two children and one was about to be born. But once again, we didn't have any money. I was not paid well at ECS. We basically lived paycheck to paycheck, and we had the home in Memphis to sell, but we hadn't built up any equity in it, so there wasn't going to be any money net coming out of that home, and we needed a place to live in Philadelphia, or just north of Philadelphia, where the seminary is. And so I assumed we would be back into the rental kind of situation, but with three children, of course, that becomes more problematic. Well, as I was registering at Westminster Seminary, I was talking to the registrar, and I tell her, we're looking for a place to live, and she said, "Well, we have a fellow who's connected with the seminary. He was a former student who's in the real estate business. Let me give me a call and see if he can work out something for you. And so she called him and made an appointment, and we got together with him, and he said, well, he said, just so happens that one of the staff members of the Orthodox Presbyterian church here in town is retiring, and he's going to be moving, and his house is coming on the market. And so he said, let me take it over. And so he took me over and showed me the house. It was a duplex, but very nice, uh, 2 bedroom house with a living room and a little den and a dining room and a kitchen and a full basement. Um, but I said to him, I said, look, I don't have a job. I don't have any money. And I've used my VA loan down there at in the house in Memphis. So uh, I can't I can't use that again because I haven't sold the house yet. And he said, well, let me take you over to the savings and loan here, and we'll see what we can work out. So I'm thinking this is a waste of time. But we go to the local savings and loan there, and I'm meeting with the loan officer with the real estate guy, and going over my circumstances with him. And he said, he asked me, well, what are you going to be working? I said, I don't have a job right now. And he said, well, what do you have for a down payment? I said, zero. I don't have any money. And so he puts down all this information, and he said, well, yeah, okay, we're going to give you a loan. He said, we've never lost a dime on a Westminster student. So I almost fell out of my chair. Um, and so that took care of that. Now we have a place to live, and Susan hadn't even seen it yet because she was back in Memphis. So I've got that worked out. But then I still know I needed a job. Well, as I said, the Army had decided they needed my services again back in '73 when I was still at Evangelical Christian School in Memphis. So I was in the Army Reserve, and I was getting some income as a result of that. Plus the fact that I still had a substantial part of my VA educational benefit back. That's another thing that you get is you have what amounts to a subsidy or a scholarship that you can use for uh, college or trade school and even seminary. It turns out. So that was going to help pay for my seminary education, and then my reserve pay provided some income, just a few $100s a month, a couple $100s a month anyway, to help with our expenses. And in those days, things were not as costly as they are today. But I still was going to need a part-time job. And so it just so happened that there was a Westminster graduate who had an entrepreneurial kind of guy, and he had started a combination of janitorial and guard service organization, security guard organization. And so they had a note on the bulletin board there at the seminary about it. So I called the fellow up, and he said, well, yeah, I need somebody. So I got a combination job as a janitor and as a security guard. And the way it would work was I go to classes during the day, and then in the evening, I would I would go and my janitor job was in a printing plant, and I would clean the bathrooms and sweep the floors and stuff like that in the printing plant. And then at midnight, I would change my shirt to my security guard shirt, and I went to a defense plant, made some kind of secret electronic kind of thing, electronics, and I would be the security guard there at night. Well, the nice thing about that job was that although I had to make rounds every hour to check the building, the security in the building, in the meantime there was nothing to do because nobody was working at night at that time, and so I would just sit there at the desk and I could do my homework. So I'd work on my Greek or my Hebrew or whatever else that I, I was working on. And then in the morning, I didn't work all the way until late morning, but most mornings I could go home and sleep for a few hours before I had to get to classes at Westminster. And like I said, one of the days, I think it was Friday, we didn't have classes anyway. So somehow we managed through that for several months. And then I got another job that was a little less stressful, working as a doorman at a apartment complex uh, there near the seminary. And that was another evening job where essentially all I had to do is stay by the front door and make sure that nobody came in that wasn't supposed to come in. And so I could do my studying while I was there. In fact, I had a kind of a funny experience with that. There were a lot of Jewish people living in that apartment complex, a very nice apartment complex. A lot of Jewish people there. One of them discovered that I was studying Hebrew because I was working on my vocabulary while I was sitting there at the front door. And so he passed the word around. Well, these Jewish people there got all excited about the fact that I was studying seminary. So I mean, they came. They offered me, that when they had clothing that they didn't want anymore, they let me have the pick of clothing, and I was just encouraging me and that kind of thing. And then in the second year of seminary, that's when they discovered that I was a librarian. So they offered me that position that let me work around my schedule. So now I could be home in the evenings, uh, and of course none of the jobs affected Sunday. We were still able to go to worship on Sunday. We got active in a Reformed Presbyterian Evangelical Synod church there, where I eventually became an elder, and so that by the time I got that job in the library, our schedule settled down. I was able to spend more time at home, and of course we had summers. We didn't have classes then. And then in my senior year, that's when Christian Study Center approached me about becoming director, and they actually moved, set up a phone system and some other office related features in our home there in the Philadelphia area, where I could, and I flew back and forth to Memphis on occasion to handle that kind of work until we actually moved after I graduated from seminary. So the Lord just provided in these utterly extraordinary ways, as he always had. It was, and finally, I guess you start to get the idea that the Lord is really going to take care of things. Now that doesn't mean that you just sit there and wait for a roast chicken to fly into your mouth. It's not like that. You do take some steps to at least look around and see what's available. But it's, in my case, at least, when you look around, uh, the Lord has already put things there, and you just have to notice them and take advantage of them.
That is definitely a story of God's faithfulness. And you've highlighted that to me a lot of times, which I really appreciate. One other question about education. If you've never met my grandfather, you should definitely walk up and ask him if his name is Dr. Doug Petersen, because he loves the fact that he has an honorary doctorate. Um, but I think for somebody that really enjoys learning as much as you do, and a question that I've wondered about is why did you not ever pursue a doctorate for your ministry? He does, to clarify, my grandfather does have a doctorate, and it's an honorary doctorate from Erskine College and Seminary, but he doesn't really feel like it's legitimate, so he doesn't like to have it pointed out. But
Well, it may be legitimate, and they actually awarded it, but it's, as I like to say, with a Doctor of Divinity and $5, you can get a cup of coffee at Starbucks. Um, they they It's not true that I didn't pursue a doctorate. When I was, you remember that when I first started out to go to college, my idea was I wanted to be a history teacher. I loved history, loved the study of history. And um, so when I finally ended up in the pastorate in Memphis after 1980, I decided that now I would work on getting a doctorate in history. Because we had a university there, the University of Memphis. I had attended there, worked doing some graduate courses in education when I was working at Evangelical Christian School. And so after we moved back to Memphis, because of the Christian Study Center being there, and finally I accepted a call to Westminster ARP Church in the summer of 1982, and was installed there as a pastor. For some weird reason, I guess thinking that, well, maybe I had more time to do some studying, and our kids were very active in school, but still they were not infants anymore, that I could start taking occasional courses. So I actually enrolled at the University of Memphis. Of course, I didn't even have a bachelor's degree in history, so I even had to take some undergraduate prerequisites for the graduate program. But I was accepted in the graduate program, and started out in the pursuit of uh, a master's in history. But then I did something really stupid, uh, and it's embarrassing to even talk about this, but it's not a secret, so you might as well know about it. In 1988, my father-in-law came to live with us, and I was, pastoring at the Westminster Church. It was a small church. It was not a real demanding kind of thing where you were busy all the time, which you would have with a larger congregation. It wasn't that sort of thing. So I had time to go to grad school or take one or two courses, and uh, it wasn't a load. That was my plan, was just to pursue that. I was also in the Army Reserve at the time, so that took up some time, a weekend, a month, and active duty during the summertime. But I was pursuing these graduate courses. My father-in-law came to live with us because he was in not good health, and we thought he would be with us for at least a number of years. It turned out that he died 2 years after he came to live with us, and he left my wife and the other children a fairly significant amount of money. Not huge or anything like that, but certainly more than we had ever had our hands on and had to manage. And so I was looking for a way to uh, invest this money in something that would seem to be fairly secure, and something that would be good for society, I guess. Wanted to be a responsible investor, and also something that I might be interested in. And so I got it in my head, the notion that it would be a good idea to open a bookstore where I could put my Kuyperian, Doiverian, Neo Calvinist worldview kind of thinking into selling books. And so we'd have an investment, and we would have a useful ministry and so forth. And just so happened that we had a lady in the church who was working in a family business with her fathers, and their father had decided to sell the business, and so she needed something else to do. And she mentioned to me that she'd always wanted to work in a bookstore, and I thought, this is perfect. All the pieces just fell into place. Some of the pieces, of course, I didn't pay any attention to, like knowing anything about running a business. For example, that piece was missing, and some others. But I plunged ahead, and my poor wife, who was has supported me through thick and thin, and even did in this case, just pleaded with me not to do it. But I thought I knew what was best. And so we opened a bookstore, and it turned into a disaster. Um, First of all, it was a massive distraction for me. Uh, had no idea how much time it would take, and that was not good for my pastorate. And it was a financial disaster as well. And so, what can I say about it? The Lord delivered us from that situation, but it was a very unpleasant 5 years, and learning that you better be a little more careful in the future about how you evaluate these things. I'm not even sure what was the question that got us to this point. I sort of wandered off. Oh, it was why didn't I get a doctorate? Well, I said all that to say that when the bookstore came along, I had to abandon the idea because, first of all, I had my father's father-in-law health situation and his eventual death, um, and then the estate to deal with. And in the midst of all of that, I just could not go to classes. I could not, so I had to abandon my pursuit of a graduate degree in history at that point. And frankly, I suppose partly because of that circumstance, I've had no particular desire to pick up that kind of academic pursuit again. I guess that's the best answer I can give for that.
That makes a lot of sense.
So that's why you're going to be poorer in the future than you might otherwise have been.
Yes. Well, we'll be all right. We'll be all right. It's it's really just it was for the stories that you're able to tell now that the Lord allowed that to happen. So
Yeah, I had once again, people come into your life. There are things that experiences I would not have had. I guess I would rather have not had the experience, but of the bookstore. But there were things that were related to that. And I remember one fellow in particular. We sold not only new books, but we sold used books as well. And there was a fellow who had his own little side business, and he would go to yard sales and things like, and he would buy good conditioned paperback books, and he was really well organized with it. And he worked out a deal where he could put his books in our store, so we didn't have to be out purchasing that many used books for our shelves. So he would supply that, and then he would give us a percentage of the sale. Well, when things began to go south, which they did very quickly in the business, and it turned into a big money pit, I was commiserating with him one day about this, and he said he was a Christian fellow, and he said, "Look, he said the Lord has a purpose in this, um, and there are things that you're going to learn from this that you wouldn't otherwise learn." And so that was an encourager who came along, as opposed to maybe some others who said, "Boy, are you dumb? You shouldn't have done that." I remember one of my elders when we moved to Kings Mountain, and I was telling him the story, and he said, "Well, you should have opened a pie shop instead of a bookstore." He said, "I eat pie all the time, but I never read a book." So that's why you have a poorer and not very heavily credentialed grandfather.
oh whatever. No,
Uh,
it's go ahead.
I think I should add to that. I don't disparage people for getting advanced degrees. I think that's fine if you love the field that you're working in, and you really think getting that advanced degree is going to be beneficial to you and beneficial to others, and you have the opportunity to pursue it. Go ahead. But I'm sort of the Mike Rowe school. I I'm I question the value of much higher education. It's I think for a lot of people, it's a matter of prestige. It's also an issue of what I think is a over credentialing emphasis in our society, where professional organizations have gotten control of access to professions, and they establish these higher and higher educational requirements so they can justify perhaps higher and higher pay and higher prestige and all the rest of that. So we end up in a society where we have the tyranny of the expert. And I think that has affected the pastorate, by the way. The pastorate, you find out, and maybe we can talk more about this as we go along, but the pastorate in many cases is more about wisdom than it is knowledge. Now, knowledge is part of wisdom, of course, but you can be an extraordinarily knowledgeable person in terms of having a lot of education and have and the ability to remember a lot of what you've learned, and still be a very unwise person when it comes to dealing with people. And the pastorate is largely a matter of dealing with people. It's not an intellectual pursuit. I always laugh. I remember a fellow back in Kings Mountain that I met. He was a Methodist minister, and he was actually illiterate. He couldn't. He had grown up without learning how to read, and he was working in business. I don't know how he was able to do it. Well, I guess he had enough minimal education that he could do what he needed to do. But he decided that God had called him to the pastorate, and so he decided he needed to learn how to read. So he learned how to read and went to seminary. And he made the comment one time. He said, "If I had known that I could get paid for reading books all day," which is his description of the pastorate, I would have done it sooner. And I thought, well, that hasn't been my experience in the pastorate. Uh, I didn't. I didn't have the option and never had the desire to spend all day reading books. So I think that, as I said, I have a somewhat more sanguine view of higher education than I did when I was younger. When I was younger, I thought having a PhD would be the cat's pajamas. My view is today, I have no need for it. I don't see where it would benefit what I'm doing as a pastor right now. After all, you can read the same books that they read when you go to graduate school. And if you don't need that credential, and I think I should say that I think the church, I think it's important that the church establishes standards for its pastors so you can say, well, this person at least is reasonably learned, so he's not simply spewing ignorance from the pulpit, uh, which I've seen some fairly highly educated people do anyway. But nevertheless, when you establish a kind of rigid criteria and say, well, you have to have such and such a degree from such and such a kind of educational institution, and if you have it, you're qualified, and if you don't, you're not, type of thing, I think that's much too arbitrary. Pastors used to be trained as apprentices, working with another experienced person in the pastorate. And I can see, and that's the way they train plumbers and electricians and carpenters and lots of people in professional fields. That's the way. That's a good way of training people in the sciences. It's certainly the way the military works, and so I think we'd be better off if we established a kind of apprenticeship type of training program for ministers of the gospel, for pastors, than by putting all the emphasis on uh, how many degrees you have. But that's my opinion.
Well, that's what we do here, Grandpa, as we talk about our opinions.
Thanks for correcting me.
No, that's great. I look forward to talking about more of the details. That's for future reference. That is one of the things we will talk about on this podcast. Is just kind of the current status of where the pastorate in the church in America is today, and in ways that my grandfather can sees that we could improve it. But I think we're getting fairly close to the end of our time. But I wonder if you could reflect a little bit as we've covered the majority of your life. You've had three pastoral callings, you've had a plethora of callings in your life to do different jobs, to volunteer in different ways. You've had three kids, 11 grandkids. What are we at now? Three or four great grandkids, and all of those things. If you could summarize all of that in a few minutes. I know you've just told me how grateful you are to God, but could you share that with other people as well?
I don't know whether I've arrived at the point where I can really um, put a circle around all that or not. It's because I'm still on that journey. I think that's one of the amazing things about it. You look back on all of those things and you see, well, now the last half of my life has been more settled. Only two locations and three long, fairly lengthy pastors. I think the average pastor in this country I remember seeing at one time was like 3.5 years or something like that. Well, my first was 13, my second was 16, and I've been here as a retired stated supply pastor for 12 years. Um, and then to watch my family uh, develop and grow along with that, and along with that, my theological and philosophical views, my worldview uh, changing and being reshaped. I really have more sense of being carried along, I guess, than being in control. I don't. I certainly can't say that I've planned all this out. I haven't really planned any of it out. I mean, I guess you know when you're moving and you go down to pick up a U-Haul truck to move your belongings, there's a little bit of planning that goes into that phase of it. So you may be on a very short-term basis, but so much of my life has been disruptive in the sense that new opportunities came along that I wasn't looking for, that just were presented to me, or new challenges, things happening. When you, like I described the birth and death of our first child, certainly we would not have. That was, as they say, an unplanned pregnancy where we're not expecting to get married. So that the pregnancy came as a surprise, and then you have the shock of the baby being born, and you can see that. Well, I'm not really in control of that, but it's just like the whole thing has been that way, uh, and so trying to, I guess, each day in some respect, maybe it's not every day, but in shorter periods of time, you say, okay, I can kind of see what the needs are around, what decisions need to be made, what actions need to be taken, and you pray, Lord, help me to use good judgment, to be wise and the decisions, and many times it's just a matter of doing what needs to be done. I have to admit I'm a terrible procrastinator on a lot of things, and I struggle with that. It's a sin that I have to keep confessing and repenting of, but never seem to really completely rise above. And I've been that way since as long as I can remember. Uh, but uh, just you just sort of take each day as it comes, and each opportunity as it comes, and each challenge as it comes, and experience shows you that. As in the terms of, some people would say, well, it all works out or all comes out in the wash or something like that, but we would say, I think as believers, uh, the Lord is always in charge of your circumstances, and He has made certain promises. He said that He will never leave us or forsake us, that He will meet all of our needs. And He always has. We have been down at times in our lives where we were down to our last dime, not just figuratively, but literally. And yet we have never lacked anything that we needed, really needed. Uh, and we have also learned in that process to not be controlled by our wants, because that's where I think some of the biggest mistakes, that the whole bookstore thing, and there I could go into some other things that weren't quite as disastrous, but nevertheless, when you allow your wants, whether it's in your career or in your marriage or your education, whatever it is, when you allow your wants to take charge of your life, or to become too important in your life, you're headed for trouble. But even then, even when that happens, you're going to experience some consequences. There's going to be some misery and suffering that comes as a result of that. But God, even then, never fails us. His grace is always sufficient for our needs, and and He's even when He's being tough with us, um, when He's given us a good spanking, He still does it in a very loving way. Um, and you see that in retrospect, and you should, I think, grow from that. It should change you. It should make you a different kind of person. It should make you more sanguine, I guess, more almost not stoical, but kind of that way, where you just move through life quietly and know. The Bible says, "Be still and know that I am God." And part of that stillness comes from simply learning from your experiences and quieting down and learning to take things as they come.
Thank you for sharing that. And yes, I think that we hope that you, as a listener, hearing my grandfather talk about his life is not something that's simply just interesting to listen to, but rather that, as I have learned hearing your story, Grandpa, that fully relying upon God's goodness and His promises is a mark of the Christian life. And not that you've done that perfectly, but thank you for sharing that story that reflects that God will not let you slip through the cracks, as you've told me in the past. So it's been super enjoyable to hear your whole story. And I look forward to a variety of topics that we're going to talk about over the next few weeks. And thank you again for sharing your life story.
You're welcome.
All right. Well, we hope to have you back next week, and thank you for listening.